Hey guys, it's Professor Hips. I wanted to walk you through the chapter on the Constitution and give you an overview of how we came to have the current system of government that we operate under. This will hit the highlights. It won't be everything that's in the textbook, but it will be a really nice overview of how we got to where we are now. So I hope that you watch this video. I hope that you read the textbook. And I hope that you combine those two to really get a solid picture of the founding of our nation, the creation of our first attempts at government, and our eventual creation and ratification of the Constitution of the United States of America. So, when looking at the Constitution, the first thing that you want to understand is what a Constitution actually is. Now, the technical definition is that it presents the fundamental principles of a government and establishes the basic structures and procedures by which the government operates to fulfill those principles. An easier way of thinking about it is a constitution is a document that tells you what the government can do and what the government can't do. Now, these constitutions are written or unwritten. So sometimes there are rules about what can and can't happen that are not written down. We call these implied powers, and we'll talk about them a little later. Or constitutions can be fully written out and easily accessible. But all constitutions have some similarities. The first thing they do is they illustrate the long-term goals of government. So what is the big picture of what government wants to accomplish? Secondly, it sets up these foundational structures. All right, so what are the entities that are actually going to make government and politics happen? In American government, we have a three sort of tiered system of government where we have the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Our Constitution lays out the expectations of each of those branches of government and essentially tells you what those branches of government can do and what those branches of government cannot do. In addition, it also lays out essential processes. So it doesn't just tell you what these branches of government can do, but it tells you how the branches of government can do it. So the rules by which the game is played. So now we're going to take a look at how we came to create the United States. So in the early 1600s, lots of colonists came from Europe to what we called the New World. Now, in fairness, it wasn't a new world. There were people already here. But for the sake of this conversation, we'll call it the New World. So people came to the New World for a myriad of different reasons. But one of the most important reasons that people came to the New World was for religious freedom. All right, they wanted to be able to sort of live their lives in any way that they saw fit without interference from the government. And this new world, these new colonies, were going to give them the opportunity to do that. So they come to the New World. They're really excited about the opportunities that are available in this new world. And for the most part, when they start to colonize, Britain is leaving them alone. Britain's not interfering in trade. Britain's not interfering in their day-to-day operations. And so the colonists are happy because they're able to essentially operate government, operate in whatever way they think best fits. So the colonists are establishing their own system of governments, establishing state governments, and they're essentially practicing whatever religious freedom they want. Now, Britain establishes a system of trade known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is a system of trade that simply says you want to establish what's known as a favorable balance of trade. So you want the countries that you trade with to need you more than you need them. So you want them to need your products and buy your products more often than you need their products or buy their products. Now, the problem with the system of government is that it limits the number of partners that the colonists are allowed to trade with. And they're very frustrated because this stops them from being able to expand and make money. So, we have this conflict that has arisen between the colonists and the British government. Now, it's made worse by the fact that the colonists aren't really in a position to be able to protect themselves from anybody who wanted to take over this new land. So, the colonists are very vulnerable, and France decides that it wants to try to take over the colonies. So, France ends up getting in a war with Britain and the Indians and the colonists, and it's known as the French and Indian War. It's also called the 7 Years' War. And long story short, the colonists in Britain win. Now, when the colonists win, they're really excited because they get a whole bunch of land from the French and the Indians. So they are able to sort of expand their borders westward. Now, the colonists believe that this means that they're going to get to expand, they're going to have new trade opportunities, they're going to have new places to get resources from. The British government is not quite as excited because they realize that the colonists expanding westward is going to make them vulnerable. It's going to leave them open to attack by the French coming back, by Indian tribes that may be located out there. And so the British government tells the colonists that they're not allowed to expand. Again, we're seeing the undercurrent of dissent between the colonists and the British government. So first the system of mercantilism, now they're telling them that they're not allowed to expand. So post-war, Britain realizes that one of the hardest things about war is that war is expensive. And now it is time to pay for the war that just took place. The British government feels that the colonists should foot some of the bill for British protection during the war. And as such, the British government starts to pass a series of taxes. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, all of these are acts that get at Britain trying to find a source of income to pay off war debt accrued by the colonies. The colonists are really upset. Now, they're not so much upset about the taxes, but they're upset about the fact that they don't have any representation in government. So we start to hear the cry of no taxation without representation. So the colonists and Britain now have a strained relationship. And it's strained even farther by the Boston Massacre. Now, the Boston Massacre is such an interesting historical event because depending on who tells it, blame shifts from the British to the colonists or from the colonists to the British. The colonists tell a story of British soldiers sort of running amok, doing whatever they want, massacring innocent people in the streets. The British soldiers tell a very different tale of an unruly crowd that they tried to disband, who refused to do so, and that they had to retaliate in self-defense. Either way, the message of British soldiers massacring innocent colonists becomes the narrative. King George, not a very nice guy. He's really, really angry about this narrative, and they respond with the Tea Act. Now, tea is one of the most popular and important drinks in the colonies at the time, and this new tax on tea makes it more difficult for the colonists to be able to access it. So, the colonists respond with the Boston Tea Party. So, the colonists dress up like Indians, they get onto British ships, and they throw tea into the river. Now, the reason this is so important is the amount of tea that they throw into the river is equivalent to several million dollars worth of inventory today. So they threw millions of dollars worth of tea into Boston Harbor, Boston. So King George is furious, and he responds by, one, sending troops to occupy the colonies, and by passing the coercive or the intolerable acts. These do several things, but some of the most important are that they close the port of Boston, which means that they no longer are able to export goods and sell goods, so they can't make money. It declares martial law, meaning the government now, the military arm of the government is going to enforce law. They suspend state governments and put a ban on town meetings, basically trying to stop them from being able to mobilize. The colonists respond in a very non-threatening way. They have a meeting known as the First Continental Congress where they discuss their grievances with the king. Now, please keep in mind that the colonies don't want to separate from Britain. At this point, they're not attempting to gain independence, they simply want the king to listen to them. So, Congress gets together, they talk about their grievances, and they send to the king a declaration of rights and grievances. Basically, their first stab at a declaration of the basic rights that a human being should have. King George responds by sending more troops. It becomes apparent that King George is not going to acquiesce. And not only is he not going to sort of give in, he's also going to escalate it through the use of more troops, through occupying more colonies. And the colonists start to figure out that bloodshed might be the only way to solve this problem. So all comes to a head April 19th, 1775. Shots are fired in Lexington, Kentucky, and Concord, Massachusetts. It's not really clear who started the fire, who started shooting, but what is clear is that this is the point that touches off the Revolutionary War. Second Continental Congress gets together. They decide that no longer can they simply be a ward of the British government, that it's time to begin functioning independently, and they prepare for war with Britain. They do so by deciding that they're going to draft a Declaration of Independence. The foundation is laid through a piece of writing known as Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And Common Sense really is a work that lays the foundation for why British rule is unacceptable. It's widely read and becomes sort of the rallying cry of the colonists. And on July 4th, 1776, we make our official Declaration of Independence. It is centered on two principles. The first is that all men are created equal and all of them have certain rights that cannot be taken away by the government. The second main point is that government has to be based on the consent of the governed, meaning the real power of government rests in the people. Now, at this point, there still is not an established federal government. So the Continental Congress encourages every state to write their own constitution. So every state writes a document that lays out sort of the foundational principles that that state is going to operate on. And all of them are based on those two principles that I mentioned before, that certain people have, that everybody has these unalienable rights, and that power should rest in the hands of the people. So, our first stab at government are known as the Articles of Confederation. This basically is all of the state constitutions being taken and used collectively. So the Articles of Confederation is a document that was created because colonists were very, very wary of centralized power. All right? They were trying to escape a king, and the last thing they wanted to do was create a system of government that replaced a king with another tyrant with a different title. But they recognized the need to have some sort of unified authority figure to handle the big picture things that a government would have to deal with. So they established something known as the Articles of Confederation, or a loose league of friendship between the states. The idea was that every state would retain its sovereignty, or its ability to rule itself. However, they would work together to try to accomplish large goals like international trade, foreign affairs, and defense. So, what the Articles of Confederation did was they created one governing body, what we call a unicameral or a one-house Congress. Every state had one vote. Approving anything required 9 votes. All right, that's a huge number. And you have to remember that a lot of colonies had to travel a significant distance to be able to make it to the central location of the government. Secondly, because it was wary of individualized power, it didn't establish a chief executive officer. In addition, the newly formed Congress did not have the power to raise money, meaning it did not have the power to tax. Tax was left to the individual states. Finally, amendments to the Constitution, so any change to the Constitution, required the approval of all 13 states. And if you remember, if you think about how difficult it is for government to get total agreement on anything, you can imagine how challenging it would have been to find 13 states that all agreed on the same things. Now, while it did create this league of friendship and allowed states to retain their autonomy and sovereignty, there were some issues. The first is that states retained their sort of control over trade, and therefore every state was trying to make trade deals that were best for that individual state. Therefore, they taxed goods from other states and other countries at varying rates. States also issued their own money. This is problematic because there was no way to make money worth the same amount or to guarantee that money was backed from a legitimate source. This caused a lot of economic hardship across a lot of the different states. Finally, and maybe most importantly, the government had a total lack of ability to protect itself. Shays' Rebellion, which was a rebellion of farmers in Massachusetts after the government took advantage of this group of farmers, they actually took over the federal courthouse, and there was really nothing that the central government could do to stop it. So these weaknesses made them realize that maybe it was going to be necessary to create a federal government, a strong centralized government that was going to be able to take care of these issues. So they sit down to amend the Articles of Confederation and end up with an entirely new document. So these men sit down together and realize that they need to figure out a way to balance a strong central government and the overall distrust of government. If you remember, we talked about in class this battle between freedom and order. So how do you create a government that is able to create order while still allowing individual people to maintain their freedom? That's the question that's truly at hand here. Now, there were some areas of agreement that regardless of what colony you were from, big or small, that there were some areas where they had consensus. The first is in dual sovereignty, that power in government would be shared between both the federal and the state government. The second area is in national supremacy. There was agreement that the federal government was going to have to be the most powerful branch of government. That if there were conflicts between state level government and federal government, that federal government was going to have to be the area that reigned supreme. The final real area of consensus was in separation of powers and checks and balances. The separation of powers is the idea that each branch of government has its own distinct set of powers, So the executive branch executes law, the legislative branch makes law, and the judicial branch interprets law. Those are three distinct areas that rely on one another to operate at its most efficient. To really have government working well, there also has to be built in checks and balances, or the ability of one branch of government to regulate the power of another branch of government. This also ensures that government operates at its most efficient. Here is a diagram of checks and balances and the way that sort of each branch can check the power of another branch of government. Now, not everything when it came to crafting a new constitution was agreement. There were also some significant differences that different colonies had about how we should craft our new system of government. First, there was disagreement about how we should create the functional structures of government. So small states wanted representation that was unified and uniform across sort of government entities, meaning small states wanted government to have a set number of representatives regardless of the size of your state. Big states wanted representation based on population. They felt that if you had more people, you should also have more power. What they ended up doing was compromising. And they created something known as the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. This created what's known as a bicameral or a two-house legislature. We now have a House of Representatives that is based on population, and we have a Senate, which every state has 2 senators. So it was the best part of the big states plan, it was the best part of the small states plan, and they came together to form a system of government that has now governed us since our inception. In addition, they created some other areas that helped them out a lot. So as government has sort of transformed over time, or maybe not transformed so much as been modified over time, we've seen some amendments that have come in and helped to regulate the power of government. So we saw the 17th Amendment, which created election of senators by the public. So up until 1913, senators were elected or chosen by other senators. The 17th Amendment allowed senators to be chosen by the people. We also saw an electoral college to help us choose the president and vice president. States were able to decide on voting eligibility requirements. And interestingly enough, although our founding documents claim that all men were created equal, there were several groups of people who were excluded from the voting process, including women, Native Americans, and slaves. Slavery becomes an issue that's going to really, really be a thorn in the side of the new American country as we move forward. So essentially what happens is in about 1787, 1788, Congress has to figure out how they're going to deal with the issue of slavery. And they realize that if they go after slavery in the Constitution, they're going to have a very hard time getting Southern colonies, now Southern states, to agree. The slave trade has become an integral part of the Southern economy, and they know that any attack on that is going to be seen as a total non-starter for Southern colonies. So, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution lays out that for 20 years, until 1808, the slave trade will be allowed to continue. The problem with this is that allowing the South to continue the slave trade for 20 years simply makes them more reliant on slave labor and is going to set the foundation for the Civil War. Article 6 of the Constitution requires states to return all fugitive slaves back to their owners. And The Three-Fifths Compromise establishes slaves as three-fifths of a person for the sake of representation in Congress. Remember, we've created a House of Representatives that is based on population, and the South has a huge slave population. Some estimates are as high as half the population were slaves. They draft a constitution that has 7 articles, moving from most important to least important. So they believe that Congress would be the most powerful, important branch of government, therefore it's Article 1. The judicial branch, they thought would be the least important, least powerful branch of government. That's why it's Article 3. So after the Constitution is drafted, now they have to figure out a way to ratify or accept it. How are they going to get this Constitution passed by the new Congress? So there were 2 groups that were at odds, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Federalists supported the Constitution and wanted to see it passed in the form that it existed in. Anti-Federalists opposed the Constitution because they believed that it gave the central government too much power, and that power would be used to erode or take away individual rights. As a way of sort of championing the Constitution, Federalists wrote something known as the Federalist Papers. These Federalist Papers were a series of essays written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, arguing that ratification of the Constitution was critical and very, very important because the only way that our new nation would succeed is if we were able to establish a strong central government. They wrote 87 essays, but the most sort of important to the creation of our government were the 9th, 10th, and 51st. While you don't need to know anything specifically about them, and we'll talk about them in class, it's important to understand that this document, written anonymously under Publius, which means the public, so written for a group of people, written for the common man, the Federalist Papers really established the idea that without a strong central government, our nation is going to be doomed to fail. The Anti-Federalist response is to recognize the fact that the Constitution gave away too much power to the national government, that both the states and individual people were the ones that were going to suffer as they were giving up their essential freedoms. They argued that a Bill of Rights was necessary to protect the average person from the evils that government presented. Thomas Jefferson, Mercy Otis Warren were some of the folks that were sort of the champions of this necessary Bill of Rights. So in 1791, they propose a Bill of Rights. The first 8 amendments lay out sort of the government's legal obligation to protect certain individual rights. The 9th Amendment exists to make sure the government didn't use the Bill of Rights as a way to limit your freedom. And finally, the 10th Amendment was sort of seen as a states' rights protection, which states that all rights that were not explicitly given to the federal government belong to the states. So finally, how do we change the Constitution? Well, this document sort of lays out the way that you can change the Constitution. Now, sometimes it's changed through the legal form, so sometimes it goes through the actual process, so where it goes through the House and the Senate, or it goes through state ratifying or state amending conventions. It also can be ratified through the court and court decisions. Now, although we have had a 200 plus year history, we've only formally amended the Constitution 27 times. One of those was to get rid of an amendment that we had created earlier. Keep in mind that there have been 10,000 proposals for new constitutional amendments, but we've only accepted 27 of them. And in fact, only 33 of them have received the necessary number of state votes to actually go to the Congress for a vote. All right. So there are three categories of amendments that have been proposed. Some extended civil liberties or civil rights, so gave people essentially more freedom. Some altered the way that branches of government worked, so extending the voting age, those types of things. And finally, some dealt with important policy issues. As I mentioned, the court has played a critical role, and I would argue that the court has become one of the most powerful branches of government. Marbury versus Madison gives the court the power of judicial review, which isn't mentioned anywhere in the Constitution, but is the ability of the judicial branch to review the constitutionality of a law, so whether or not a law adheres to the Constitution. So that is the Constitution in a nutshell. All right, that's an overview for you. What I want you to do, again, review this video as many times as you need to, read the book, and you should have a solid understanding then of the process by which we came to the Constitution. We'll fill in some of the details in class, but as always, if you have any questions, you can email me, you can text me, or you can save your questions to ask in class.